It's only on a voluntary basis, so how much to make of Russian authorities offering citizens a ride out of Belgorod, the western city across from Ukraine's Kharkiv, increasingly the target of Moscow's own medicine, a steady diet of missiles from the sky. As NATO leaders meet in Brussels this Wednesday, the battle for air superiority is squarely on the radar of both sides. And as we approach the third anniversary of Vladimir Putin's bid to take Kyiv, drones, planes, and the flying projectiles they carry could make all the difference in breaking a bloody stalemate on the ground. For the West, it's a race against time, what with financing for Ukraine in limbo, and 2024 serving up the chance of Donald Trump returning to power in the United States. We'll ask about Europe's efforts to ensure its own defense and thwart Putin's westward march. Today in the France 24 debate, Ukraine's race to rearm. Joining us, retired General Michel Yakovlev, former senior commander at NATO and professor at the Paris School of International Affairs.
Good evening.
Good evening and Happy New Year. Happy New Year as well to Anastasia Shapochkina, lecturer in geopolitics at the French Political Science Institute, Sciences Po, president of the Eastern Circles think tank.
Thank you.
Thanks for being with us. Thanks as well to former French ambassador to Moscow, Jean de Clignasty. Good to see you. And from Vilnius, political analyst Alexandra Filipenko, welcome back to the show.
For having me, and Happy New Year.
Your reactions on the hashtag F24debate. 93 more children evacuated from Belgorod this Wednesday, so says the governor of that border region with Ukraine. They're being sent to rest in the neighboring Voronezh region, says Vyacheslav Gadkov. On Monday, he announced the first evacuation.
Over the past 24 hours, we received 1,300 applications to send children of the Belgorod city to the country school camps and to other regions.
Anastasia Shapochkina, what's happening in Belgorod?
So Belgorod has been bombed many times over since before the New Year, since December 30th. So they had casualties, 25 people dead at least, over 100 people wounded. And this is now something that unofficially, at least in Ukrainian media, there is pretty much a media coverage about this as a Ukrainian response to the Russian bombings, which means, if we take it as at its word, that Ukraine has been allowed, finally, to bomb Russia. So far, Russians...
Because there have been cross-border bombings before. This one's different, though.
It's different because it is really over several days. It's not just one day. It is in the city center. It is missiles. So it isn't just something that happened accidentally, you know. Overall in Russia, and especially not only in near the border areas, but also other areas, there were even Russian planes which crashed upon takeoff. But this is totally different from that. And that really brings the war to a Russian city. They are not prepared with bomb shelters. In 2 years, they haven't thought about that. The Russians are trying to massively increase their effort around Kharkiv. That is not very successful, to create that buffer zone. And the residents really are unprepared. There hasn't been much preparation for that. People were just going to meet the New Year, so to say. And now for the first time, the Russians can feel the war at their home. They can no longer say the war is there somewhere else, and it has nothing to do with us.
Alexandra Filipenko, you monitor Russian media. How much coverage has there been in this story?
Amazingly, there was not that much coverage, just as we haven't seen much coverage of other moments when Russia was bombed, actually, by drones, and when Moscow was bombed by drones, even the Kremlin. And probably Ukrainians expect that this way they will cause a revolt in Russia against Putin, but they live in a democratic society, on the contrary to Russia. The fact that Putin, thank God, did not succeed in causing a revolt of Ukrainians against Zelensky, it's a positive thing. But in principle, a revolt is possible in Ukraine, because Ukraine is a democratic country. Russia is a different different country. And Putin, I am absolutely convinced, he doesn't care whether his subjects die or not. He doesn't care if some Russian cities are fully destroyed. Because we must remember that Putin didn't only destroy Mariupol, for example, or Mariinka or other Ukrainian cities. He destroyed Grozny during the Chechen War, and we must take that into consideration. So basically, Vladimir Putin doesn't care what happens to his subjects, and Russian media fully works for only one person, and that one person is President Putin. They want to please President Putin. So propaganda only works for him and for the way that he likes to hear the news. So there was not that much coverage, and they are still saying that everything is going according to the plan.
There's little coverage of what's going on there. We've seen a lot of coverage, Anastasia Shapachkina, of missile attacks on Kharkiv. The mayor of the city announcing that an unused summer camp had been hit overnight.
In general, Kharkiv has been bombed very intensely. There's a very intensified bombing of civilian areas of the city center, especially. It's completely devastated and deserted. And it's been bombed, especially including the city center, from the very outset of the war, from the first days. But in the last couple of weeks, it's intensified. And one of the reasons why it may be that the Russians are trying to basically push Ukrainian army a bit further, or to create a buffer zone. For that, we haven't seen yet any success. And in any case, it has to be pushed so far back from, let's say, Belgorod or other near border areas that HIMARS cannot reach it, for example.
So Kharkiv, the country's second city, the areas around it retaken in 2022. General Yakovlev, what's the objective here for Russia? Just simply to degrade, or is there an actual military objective of retaking that area?
I doubt the Russians have the ability to retake the area, nor to retake much in general terms. Both armies are at a standstill. They are roughly at par, with a disadvantage to the Ukrainians in manpower and artillery, and more specifically ammunition. I don't have private information to say that. That's my reading of what we see on the ground, and what we get through open sources. That said, though the Ukrainians are at a disadvantage, they are not at such a disadvantage that the Russians could actually take advantage of it. Even if they punched a hole, which I don't think they can achieve, they wouldn't have the troops to go through and do a blitzkrieg, for example. And Kharkiv is less within reach now than it was in February 2022, and we know what happened to it. So my suspicion is that they're in for the long haul, both sides, trying to harass, change a bit the rules of the game, hence the limited attacks on Belgorod, because militarily speaking, it's not very significant, actually. It's just going to be more of the same. This is not a major turn in the war today, we'll just have more of the same.
So a war of attrition, and what
Yeah.
we're seeing is, though, this race to have the air supremacy. We saw last week Ukraine's prosecutor's office speculating on a possible North Korean origin for a missile that hit Kharkiv on January the 6th. Your reaction to that, Michel Yakovlev?
Well, it appears documented that the North Korea has provided missiles and ammunition to Russia, which is a reflection on the state of Russian production, by the way, and also consumption, because the Russians tend to burn a lot of ammunition. So they do create destruction on a large scale with no strategic effects so far. And I doubt they'll achieve it in the coming months, even with Korean missiles.
Jean de Grigny, what's the objective at this point?
I think the quality of the missiles is not the problem. The problem is the quantity. And I think the Russians are ready to buy any missiles, any shell, anywhere in the world. They want to overwhelm the anti-missile defense of Ukraine. So it doesn't, I mean, the fact that the Russians are buying some missiles from North Korea doesn't mean that they need sophisticated missiles. No, they just want missiles and shells to overwhelm the Ukrainian forces.
Just to overwhelm them. And then, so the question begs then, we seem to be in a sort of an aerial arms race with these drones, with these projectiles of all sorts. What lessons have you learned from that?
Well, the lesson, I think for us, French, is very important, the lesson that I speak under the monitoring of General Yakovlev. But the lesson is, I think, that quantity is perhaps more important than quality.
Agreed?
Yeah, definitely. What the Russians have achieved is a massification. They have improved technically. 1 year ago, my perception was that they are not a learning army. When we saw after the counteroffensives and so on, and their initial re-assaults early 23, now they're operating better. They have better integrated electronic warfare, cyber.
And how are Ukraine's air defenses holding up?
Well, the Ukrainians have, by their own admission, they're running short of ammunition, or they don't have enough, so they have to prioritize. So their interception rates are degraded. That said, they're still above 70%, which is pretty good. And even then, it doesn't mean, I mean, it's a wrong idea to think that even if there was no air defense left, then Ukraine would be bombed into submission. Germany was not in 1945. It needed to be invaded. So even if Russian missiles had a free access to whatever target they wanted to blast, they would destroy much of Ukraine, but they would not stop the war.
And we had at the start of the year, and those who support Ukraine will be clutching at straws perhaps, but Denmark saying, yes, we're going to be delivering F-16 fighter jets. Are you scanning the skies?
The F-16 saga is a year-long story. Another reflection on the fact that the West, in general terms, has provided a lot to Ukraine, but always in small increments and always too late. General MacArthur said, defeat boils down to two words, too late. And that's where we are. Now, the F-16s all themselves will not be a game changer. It's even if they had 100, currently the skies over Ukraine are contested. Russian aircraft, when they fly, quite often are downed. Only missiles fly, and they fly to die, basically. So contested air will remain contested. Even if the Ukrainians have a large modern air force, they won't be able to fly much better than the Russians today.
Anastasia Shapachkina?
What they may be able to do, though, is to shoot farther and to shoot maybe closer to the border. They may use the airplanes as shooting platforms and targets inside Russia, especially the depots, the warehouses, the military objects, the industrial objects, including deeper and deeper into the Russian territory. It's not just about keeping the fight in Ukraine. It's about bringing the fight to the Russians. As we see, it's a turn around, we can say, which is now going to be, if Ukraine indeed is allowed to do that, more and more emphasized. And F-16s are also needed for that, in addition to defending the skies. And I want to emphasize that in Ukraine, the anti-air defense missiles, they are active, especially around Kyiv. But there are numerous cities which remain undefended and entirely at the mercy of bombings. And that goes from Lviv, that goes as well as for Zaporizhia, as well as for Kherson. And so there it is. I would say, I don't know how optimistic it is to say that today Ukrainians got it under control. They don't need the planes.
Zaporizhia and Kherson, which are right next to the front line, much harder to defend.
Indeed, yep. And they take artillery fire in any case, so you don't. That's not an air question.
Dnipropetrovsk.
Now,
you have Kryvyi Rih, you have Yeah, you have Rivne, you have any type of city, you can name it, throughout Ukraine, which have been bombarded since before the new year constantly. The anti-air defense system does not manage to stop those bombs.
Also, the F-16s, their main advantage would be in pushing back the aircraft that launch missiles, the caliber missiles. But given the range of the missiles, that means actually intercepting them over Russian airspace, deep into Russian airspace. That is something, let's say, it's not a vision of heaven in Washington, to have F-16s roaming into Russian airspace and shooting down Russian aircraft 800 miles into Russia so as to prevent them from shooting into Ukraine.
But if I may just disagree with what Mr. Justice, that quantity that we have seen in these 2 years, one lesson learned, that quantity triumphs quality. We have seen that Russia applied that strategy. Whether that strategy has been victorious, I do not know if we have a lot of proof. Because with the same, Russia had more quantity and more resources on its own without North Korea and Iran in the first year of war. And it was in the first year of war, in the fall 2022, that it lost most of the territory which was reconquered by Ukrainian army, which at that point was far more numerous, had much fewer resources, and had absolutely worked from the underdog perspective. And that includes as much the defense of Kharkiv, which was, if we can say, put together in the last moment, and a lot of it was carried out by people who, for the first time, found themselves under guns. And Kharkiv was retaken, the region was retaken from the Russians, as well as for the defense of Kherson, for retaking of Kherson. So yes, the Russians showed to the world that they are able to sacrifice what now is estimated 350,000 people in the 2 years time span with no political cost whatsoever to the leader. But have they won the war?
Well, I think the conclusion is exactly the reverse. At that time, the Russians were not so numerous. And at the beginning of the war, they thought they could win with 1,100 people.
100,000 troops.
100,000 people and no more. Now they understood that they need a clear superiority to win. And the war is not finished yet. And they are accumulating resources, shell,
and having more and more harder
tanks
time also mobilizing their population. I want to remind that in the very beginning of the offensive, before the Russians started the war, just the troops which were used to surround Ukraine all along its border were 190,000, not 100,000. That was on day one of the war. Then throughout the year, Russians have increased this capacity by 300,000 before September, before they announced a new wave, actual wave of mobilization. So that is, they haven't really calculated with 100,000, that's too little, even from the very first day from the outset. It was about twice as much, and many. And then by September, when they started really losing to Ukrainian counteroffensive, they had mobilized about 500,000 people already.
Yes. So now they count on their population, the number of the troops, the number of missiles, shells, and most probably planes also, because up to now, most of Russian planes have not been used. They're kept aside for the last moment. So I think the question of the quantity is crucial.
All right, neither side is talking about casualty figures, but the anecdotal evidence points to a brutal toll all around. The front, which has barely budged during the third winter. In Rome this Wednesday, Italy's staunchly pro-Ukraine defense minister warned the lower house of parliament of war fatigue among both Russians and Europeans.
It seems that the time has come for an incisive diplomatic action to accompany our aid, because a number of important signals are being detected, coming from both sides.
Alexandra Filipenko calling for an incisive diplomatic action there. Again, this is from a defense minister who is staunchly in the pro-Ukraine camp. Your reaction to that?
Well, it looks like, and what I've been seeing in the United States also, and what we all see in the Congress right now, it is that even those politicians who are pro-Ukrainian are now speaking about a possibility of talks and that any war must end with talks, although the White House is still saying their mantra, they're repeating the mantra of nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. But we see that in the United States, as well as in Europe, there are less people who are ready to support Ukraine the way they were ready to support it in 22 and beginning of 23 especially. And I must say that in Russia also the support of the war is going down, although we cannot count actually, because all the sociological services are pro-governmental, they're only official and governmental, there are no independent sociology, there's no independent sociology in Russia. And even though we can say that, for example, Levada Center, one of the sociological centers, they've said that the level of support of the actions of the Russian armed forces is high, 74%. But what does it say in a society that Russia is right now, in a totalitarian regime, actually? We must recall that speaking out against the war is dangerous. It will definitely bring you to jail. So it potentially brings you to jail, at least. So we can only say that there are 25% of brave people who are ready to say to a stranger that they are against the government, because now in Russia and Belarus it's a guaranteed path to prison. So political analysts actually estimate that the actual support for the war in Russia is about 15 to 20%, because we must note, and we should only remember, how no one came out to defend the Kremlin when Prigozhin went there, when Prigozhin was going to Moscow. Everyone only welcomed Prigozhin, took pictures with him, and was following his path. So he could potentially even come to Moscow. So now we see this, that there is less and less support for the war in Russia too. And also the only, I wouldn't even call it an opposition force, an opposition power, the only organization that can say something against not even the war, but against the mobilization, is the organization of wives of the mobilized people, Way Home, they're called. And they appeal to the president, they appeal to Russian politicians, they ask for their mobilized husbands and sons to be brought back. And they are the only ones who are now not speaking out against the war. I'm sorry, I must say special military operation, that's how they're calling it. But they are the only ones who can or might say at least something that goes against the government. So the figures of 25% against the war, according to official sociological services, must actually tell us that there are so much more people who are against the war, even inside Russia right now.
Now, Alexandra, you had Ukraine's president come your way this Wednesday, Volodymyr Zelensky, on a tour of Baltic states. He, looking at the other side, insisted support is still strong. Let's listen.
First of all, there is no pressure from our partners to stop our defense. I would not say stopping of hostilities yet. It is our defense. The termination of our fair defense and the termination of our struggle is under no pressure in relation to the frozen conflict, at least not yet.
Was that the equivalent, Anastasia, of a football club owner insisting that he's fully supporting the manager?
It's a good parallel. Yeah. So the here, of course, this announcement is coming against the backdrop of a Bloomberg article, recent article, which claims that there was a meeting of national security advisors in Saudi Arabia over the last couple of weeks, and with the invitation of some, what is called the Global South countries, and others have declined. And also China was invited and declined, and just sent a word. But basically the subject of that meeting was the peace negotiations. What is clear is that Ukraine now, because Ukraine's ability to defend itself and its ability to fight is defined only by the European and US support, military support and financial support. As soon as that support is cut, Ukraine will not be able to defend itself. It may still resist, as Michel Yakovlev just rightly pointed out. But that is going to be suicidal. Now, that support doesn't depend on Ukraine's ability to fight, on Ukraine's will to fight, or on its desire and to go as long as needed. It depends only on the internal political factors within the European Union and the nation states and in Washington. And that, indeed, that support, what we have been seeing over the last, since October 7th, in fact, that support has been stalled, maybe evaporating, and hopefully is going to be continued. Now, today, within the NATO-Ukraine summit in NATO, that we've heard the statements that support is going to continue, and bilateral support has continued even through December by Germany, for example, important ally. But that is not enough. We need a massive support. The 50 billion blocked in the European Union, 61 billion blocked in the United States means that even if that money is not coming, say nothing of weapons, there's nothing going to be to shoot with, and there's nothing going to be to pay, for example, pensions and salaries.
So, Alexander Filipenko, what did you parse from Volodymyr Zelensky's visit to Vilnius, as well as to neighboring Latvia and Estonia?
Well, first of all, they agreed that together with Lithuania, they will jointly produce anti-drone weapons, and that Ukraine will receive 200 million euros in military aid. And I must say that it's a stark difference, of course, between President Volodymyr Zelensky and President Putin, because Volodymyr Zelensky in Vilnius, he spoke in the square outside the presidential palace. And while he was speaking, they were both there, two presidents were there, and the president of Lithuania was also there. And in stark contrast to President Putin, they were speaking, and the access to the palace was free for all citizens, for anyone, not only citizens of Lithuania, for all comers, for anyone. It's a colossal difference from President Putin, who meets even with his supporters at a distance of a few meters and under close supervision of security guards. But the main thing, of course, it's just the thing that was interesting for me, of course. And but I think the important thing is that in his speech, Zelensky said that he was sure that Russia will not stop. They will not retreat. That Ukraine right now must stop Russia. And he is absolutely sure that if President Putin wins, he will go and attack all the neighbors, including Lithuania, and followed by Poland, of course, and also Moldova and other countries that are close to Russia. So President Zelensky is trying to say to the world that Putin will not stop. And this is how it actually looks right now, because, again, even though nothing is going according to the plan, but Kremlin is still saying that everything is going according to the plan, and they are not showing any signs of stopping. So President Zelensky stressed that the whole Europe must come together, and that Ukraine is now fighting for Europe and the whole world. He repeated that. He said that before, but that in that speech, he just stressed it again and again.
And with U.S. aid to Ukraine stalled in the Republican-controlled House of Representatives, it's been Germany's chancellor this week calling on Europe to raise its game. Olaf Scholz, speaking Monday in the company of Luxembourg's prime minister, pointed to Berlin's doubling of its own military aid budget for Kyiv in 2024, up to 8 billion euros.
As great as our German contribution is, it will not alone be enough to guarantee Ukraine's security in the long term. I therefore call on our allies in the European Union to also step up their efforts in support of Ukraine. In any case, the arms deliveries for Ukraine planned by the majority of EU member states to date are too small.
So how does a French general feel about being told by the Germans you're not doing enough militarily?
It's a fact. It's a fact. Now, that said, the Kiel figures are awful for France, but the French don't give a damn, because much of what they give is not public.
The Kiel figures from the Kiel Institute.
Yes,
we'll see some of those in a moment.
So they are, seems to me, methodically speaking, they are questionable. That said, what is certain is that the Germans are providing much more than the French. That's true. The French, for example, the German Leopard tanks, German-made Leopard tanks, are a big part of the equation. Our industrial base in Western Europe, it's not only France, is too small to meet the requirements of a war like this. And that applies to all nations, to include Germany. This war started in 2014. It didn't start in 2022. What have we done between 2014 and 2022? We just sat on our hands, and that was it, hoping for the best. Hoping for the best being in the hands of Putin. And now, 2 years after this war has become the monster it is, we are still not on a war footing. Neither Germany, nor France, nor Italy, nor the UK. We are doing better, we are producing more, we're cranking up, but as if we had the luxury of 20 years ahead of us.
All right, let's talk about that. You mentioned those figures put forth by this institute in Germany, the Kiel Institute, which shows among the laggards in direct military aid to Ukraine, the French. This is in actual sums. And you see France is 15th on that list. The French say that their argument is they've been sending troops and supplies as well to the eastern flank, to Romania, to Estonia. The war in Ukraine, as General Yakovlev is saying, has been a wake-up call for a nation whose supplies have been stretched. France has the know-how, but as Claire Bacanin reports, ramping up that production takes time.
The Nexter KNDS group produces cannons destined for France's César truck-mounted artillery system. Production of César systems has gone from 2 to 6 a month and will increase to 8 a month in 2024. But this increase has only been possible because the manufacturer invested in new machinery before the escalation of the conflict in Ukraine.
We invested in the machine 3 years ago. It has been operating for the last year. We made the investment before the current situation in Ukraine. A second machine like this will arrive in 2024.
Manufacturers are racing to produce enough supplies to send to Ukraine and build up the French armed forces supply. In 2022, France handed over 18 César systems to Ukraine and is sending a further 12. The manufacturer can meet increasing demand because the defense industry, even after the Cold War ended, continued to produce at a minimum level so as not to lose industrial know-how.
In France, we have the concept of strategic autonomy. We try to have a bit of everything. We made the choice in France to keep most of our capabilities because we wanted to develop them ourselves and to produce them in France, sometimes with partners. So we reduced production instead of sacrificing it.
After years of decreased spending, in 2018, France boosted the budget for its armed forces. A new generation of armored vehicles, like the Serval, is now replacing the old stock, some of which date back to the 70s and 80s.
Okay, so 12 plus 18 makes 30. What do 30 Caesar cannons buy you if you're Ukraine?
They help a lot because they're very good at counter-battery in particular. So at, let's say, diminishing the rate of fire of the opposing side. And they use much less ammunition than the Soviet type for the same effect. So it does help. It helps. Let's say, now France didn't have a large artillery. The Swiss army has much more artillery than the French today. Finland has about 4 times the French artillery. It's, you know, a result of constant reduction in format means that now France is stretched thin, not very deep. But that is true of Germany also.
And now there's this talk of joint procurement at the European level, of ramping up production. We've heard it from France's European Commissioner, Thierry Breton, most notably. Jean de Clignasty, has this been a time where there is a change going on, or is it?
Yes, I think it's I wouldn't say a game changer, but anyway, everybody tries to get the most from this fund, and everybody makes a lot of efforts to get the money and to export its armament.
How do you explain the fact that France, which has military presence on several continents, is around the globe even, is providing so little direct military aid to Ukraine?
Well, I think our presence is a very light presence. You have no heavy armament in our base in Africa. You have no heavy armament anywhere in the world. They are very light. I mean, you have some armored cars, no heavy tanks, no anti-missile, anti-air defense in Africa. No need. So that's why perhaps we are under-equipped to help.
What's your reaction when you hear the floor manager there at that plant in the center of France saying we're going to have a second machine to build these Caesar tanks?
Well, I think we do our best, but we are not in a beauty contest. There are many elements which have to be taken into account, diplomatic aid and sometimes intelligence and training and all that. So it's very difficult to compare. Everybody tries to be the most beautiful and the most efficient, but it's not so simple.
Anastasia Shapochkina.
I absolutely agree that France is not a good example because especially because Africa is not a good example. Precisely because France managed to lose its influence in 2 African countries, Mali and Niger, in the 6 months of 2023 alone. So I don't think it's a good example at all. Indeed, the French military presence elsewhere is not a good example. What is a good example of the French industrial base is not its military presence in Africa, but rather its exports, military exports. And it's not, I absolutely disagree with the fact that we are doing our best. We indeed are not in a beauty contest, we are at war. And for war, we are not doing our best at all, nowhere near, because in the end of the day, it's not about France should not make itself smaller than it is. It's one of the biggest military exporters in the world. And it's not about how many artillery systems they managed to put in the middle of the desert in this or that African country. It's about how many Rafales does France export to India, to Saudi Arabia, to African countries who are willing to pay for it. How many tanks does it export? How many different systems, including anti-air missile systems, does it export and produce? It's about political choices. Do you choose to take the money from the European pot, and are you given the money from the European pot, or is Germany given the money, or Sweden, or someone else who is also producing weapons? And are you willing to take the money from there, or rather you would direct your limited but still extraordinarily significant industrial capacity in order to sell the weapons to your strategic allies? This is about strategic political choices and not about industrial capacity alone.
Jean de Glignasti?
Well, let's tell the truth. It will not be enough in any case. Ukraine wants, if the US stop helping Ukraine, I don't think they will stop, but if that will be a game changer, and Ukraine will have to yield. If we increase a bit, if we do even better, I don't think it will change anything. So the victory or the defeat is in the hand of the US.
Michel Yakovlev, next Monday is the Iowa caucuses in the United States. That's the start of the campaign for the US presidency. In Brussels, at NATO, on the quiet, what are the contingency plans if Donald Trump returns to office?
I don't know. Suicide, maybe. Beyond the joke, the Americans tend to follow their interests. Even President Trump can understand that. And the interest of America is not to let Ukraine sink. Now, is it to score a massive victory against Russia? I don't think so. And that's where we are now. Ukraine is defending itself enough to meet American strategy. And it's unfortunate for Ukraine that American strategy is not outright victory of Ukraine. If it were achievable, with the means at hand to include an America, which is not a given.
But
Now,
understandably so. You're talking about the U.S. argument is, watch out, this is a nuclear power that Ukraine is facing. We don't want to be dragged into a war.
well, currently the war is done by Ukraine. The Ukrainians are fighting for us, the Europeans and NATO, from the very beginning, from 2014, I say again, with little recognition until recently. Now, I don't think America can let Ukraine go down the sink, whether Trump or not. There'll be the deep state that will say we can't have what happened in Kabul, which was basically inconsequential to all of us, not for the Afghans, unfortunately, but we in Europe, quite frankly, we don't give a damn. I'm being very cynical there. Ukraine is another story, a completely different story. So I believe, I suspect the Americans, whoever is in charge as from next year, will follow the interest of America.
Well, are you reassured, Anastasia Shapochkina?
As a Ukrainian American and a participant in the upcoming elections, I actually am not reassured. Because all of my fellow Americans, those that I am in touch with, including those in Washington, including those in New York, I'm not in touch with people in Wyoming, but in Washington, New York, yes. They all agree about one thing, is that if Trump becomes president of the United States, we're not even going to be talking about Ukraine anymore. Not only is it going to stop matter, the whole ballgame is going to change. People believe very strongly that they have all the signs at their disposal, including the January 6th attack on the Capitol, led by Donald Trump and encouraged by him, that Donald Trump's interests do not coincide with the U.S. interest. And this might be an unprecedented, already is an unprecedented case that he can run for office, can be an unprecedented case in the U.S. history, when indeed that deep state doesn't work. And I agree with you, it has worked all along. But that may be the ending. That's what every single person believes who is not ready to vote for Donald Trump. There's not just the risk of that, there is near certainty that the U.S.
Definitely
is
what
going
Putin is banking on from the beginning.
And the U.S. is going to leave the world stage as a geopolitical actor.
Yeah.
And in that case, you see, what is true that, it doesn't matter if the Europeans increase their defense capacity. It doesn't matter for Ukraine. But it does matter for Europe. Because what you're thinking you're discussing right now, what you think we're not discussing, is the fate of Ukraine. But it isn't. Because Putin has never talked about the fate of Ukraine. For Putin, Ukraine is not even a country. Putin has always talked, since the end of 2021, about only one thing and one thing only, and that is reviewing the European security architecture. For him, Ukraine is not part of Europe and is not even a state. And that's why that matters for Europe and not for Ukraine, whether the Europeans are capable of ensuring their own defenses. Because given come November 2024, there is not going to be any more Papa behind you. Because I remind you, Mr. Kennedy, that had not been for America, we would have spoken all German today, right? Because France didn't even dare to raise its hat to Hitler. And now the only reason we're speaking French is the United States. So when you're talking about the possibility that our efforts as French do not matter in the military effort, you're talking about the possibility of actually just over-reliance on the US to the point that when they change their position geopolitically, and the US has been geopolitically active only over the last 80 years, not before. It's almost an anomaly that has been such a geopolitically active actor. And if it comes back to a historic normal, what does Europe do then? Having run out of all of the weapons.
Well, as you guess, I don't share your point of view. First, I don't think Putin has the possibility and even the will to go further. I mean, its main objective, its main goal is to reconstitute an area of influence which corresponds more or less to the USSR. And the fact itself that Ukraine, the poor army of Ukraine, could stop the attack coming from Russia shows that the Russian troops are weakened and they can't go further, I don't think, even in case of victory in Ukraine.
All right, well,
so I don't believe.
Let's listen to the man himself. 9 time zones away from Belgorod, Vladimir Putin showcasing the self-reliance of a vegetable hothouse. This is in the Far East Pacific city of Anadyr. Outside temperature minus 16 Celsius, by the way. Russia's president predicting a better 2024 for his side than the West.
It turned out that their dependence is greater than ours. The main thing that we proved to ourselves and the whole world is that Russia is a self-sufficient country in every sense of the words. Strong, moving forwards, confidently moving forwards. This is absolutely the most important result of the last year.
Alexandra Filipenko, very briefly, what does your crystal ball say about 2024?
Oh, well, it doesn't really look. It's not a great backdrop for the election campaign because actually frosty winter revealed large-scale problems in Russia, in the communal systems in Russia. Hundreds of thousands of Russians across the country are left without heating in abnormally low temperatures. And residents of different cities near Moscow and in Siberia, all over Russia, are rallying around bonfires at the streets and appealing to the officials and the internet, and they complain about the lack of heat and hot water. So in general, this story is about Kremlin believing its own propaganda, and this is, I think, a great danger that Putin believes what his propaganda is saying. And the story of freezing Russian cities, actually, that are freezing, not Europe is freezing. It's absolutely biblical in its clarity because it seems like God punishes Russia for its arrogance. After all, at the beginning of the war, Russian officials only talked about how Europe would freeze without Russian gas, and propaganda videos were published which showed freezing European cities and freezing Europeans. But now we see President Putin saying not the same things, but mainly projecting that he is sure that everything will be great and everything will be perfect for him and his political campaign. The fact that Alexei Navalny is in prison, the fact how he's being treated, the fact that Russian authorities don't plan to open polling stations in unfriendly countries like the European Union and many other countries around the world for the presidential elections, it doesn't show that
It's not a good look. We're going to have to leave it there. Alexandra Filipenko, I want to thank you so much for joining us from Vilnius. I want to thank Anastasia Shapachkina, Jean de Grigny-Asti. I want to thank as well Michel Yakovlev. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.